The knock came at 9:30 on a Tuesday evening, the kind of knock that doesn't belong to any world I've ever inhabited. I was marking papers, 37 essays, on the symbolism of autumn in classical poetry, each one a small window into the minds of my students, the only people in this town who seemed to notice I existed. My apartment was modest, the sort of place that apologizes for itself. 2 rooms above a shuttered bookshop, walls the color of old cream, furniture that had belonged to someone else's life before mine. I had been living here for 4 years, ever since the family redistribution of assets had left me with nothing but my pride and a teaching salary that barely covered rent. The knock came again, harder. I set down my red pen, the one I used for corrections, never for praise, because praise felt dishonest, and moved toward the door. Through the peephole, I saw nothing but darkness and the distorted shape of a man's shoulder. My heart did something strange, a little skip jump that I immediately suppressed. Nothing good came from unexpected visitors at this hour. When I opened the door, the cold air rushed in first, carrying with it the scent of autumn and something else, something expensive and foreign. Then I saw him, Lindsay. I knew him the way one knows a figure from a dream, not from direct encounter, but from the periphery of someone else's life. My brother-in-law? No, that wasn't right. My mentor's protege. The man whose photograph had appeared in the news feeds I scrolled through late at night. The one whose name my brother-in-law had spoken with a mixture of reverence and something darker, something like fear. He was taller than I'd expected, broader, the kind of man who seemed to occupy more space than his physical form should allow. His suit was charcoal gray, immaculate, and his eyes, God, his eyes were the color of winter water, cold and fathomless, and fixed directly on me with an intensity that made me want to step backward into my apartment and lock the door. "Suwon," he said. Not a question, a statement of fact, delivered in a voice that suggested he'd been certain of my existence all along. Yes? The word came out smaller than I intended. I was acutely aware of my appearance, the cardigan I'd thrown on over my teaching clothes, the way my hair was pinned up haphazardly, the faint smudge of red pen on my left hand. I looked like what I was, a provincial school teacher, invisible and unremarkable. "May I come in?" It wasn't really a question either. I should have said no. I should have closed the door and called the police or my brother-in-law or someone, anyone. But there was something in his expression, not quite urgency, but something close to it, that made me step aside. He moved past me into my small living room, bringing with him the scent of expensive cologne and the cold of the outside world. The space suddenly felt even smaller. "I have something to show you," he said, and he pulled out his phone. The video was short, 30 seconds, maybe less. My brother-in-law's face filled the screen, but it was a version of him I'd never seen, diminished somehow, as though the camera was capturing him at the moment he was becoming something less than himself. His voice when he spoke was thin and strained. "Z, my sister is my only kin. My political rivals will use her as a pawn to tear her apart. You must marry her, protect her, and use your power to secure a path to survival for her. This is my final entrustment to you." I stood very still. The room seemed to tilt slightly, as though the floor had become unreliable. That's not. Turn the world better simply by the force of his will. And yet, at home, he was a ghost. We existed in parallel, occupying the same vast space, but rarely intersecting. He worked behind the closed door of his study until the early hours. I curled up in my enormous bed with a book, listening to the distant murmur of phone calls conducted in a voice too low to decipher. We shared breakfast in silence, the clink of his coffee cup against its saucer the only conversation between us. I was, in every way that mattered, alone. Mrs. Chen and the staff treated me with a politeness so precise it bordered on contempt. Meals appeared and disappeared. My laundry was done, my room was cleaned, but no one spoke to me beyond what was strictly necessary. I was a political prop, and everyone in that penthouse knew it. One night, unable to sleep, I wandered into the kitchen at 2 a.m. and found Lindsay there, standing at the counter with a glass of whiskey, his tie loosened, his hair slightly disheveled. He looked almost human. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "The bed is too big," I said, and immediately felt foolish. But he didn't laugh. He just looked at me with those winter water eyes and said, "Mine too." We stood there for a moment in the half-light of the kitchen, two strangers married to each other, separated by a marble island and a distance I didn't know how to cross. Then he put down his glass, said, "Good night, Suwan," and walked past me toward his room. His sleeve brushed my arm as he passed. The contact was so brief it barely registered on my skin, but I felt it reverberating through me for hours afterward, a phantom warmth in the cold architecture of my new life. I am a ghost in a gilded cage, I thought, lying in that enormous bed, staring at the city lights through my window. And I don't know if I'm haunting him or if he's haunting me. The attack began on a Monday. I was in the penthouse library, the only room that felt remotely like a place I might belong, organizing Lindsay's campaign briefing files. I'd started doing this without being asked, simply because the disorder offended my teacher's instincts, and because it gave me something to do besides marinate in my own insignificance. His policy papers were brilliant, but chaotically organized, scattered across 3 desks and a filing cabinet with no discernible system. I'd been quietly creating one. Color-coded folders, cross-referenced indexes, annotated timelines of legislative precedents. No one had noticed. No one ever noticed what I did. My phone buzzed. Then again. Then it didn't stop. The first article was from a tabloid outlet, the kind that fed on political gossip like a parasite. Lindsay's Secret Bride, a family of frauds. The piece laid out in meticulous and largely fabricated detail a history of financial mismanagement in my family. My father's debts, my relatives' lawsuits, insinuations about money laundering that had no basis in reality but sounded devastating in print. The second article was worse. It featured quotes from my cousin, the one Lindsay had warned me about. He described me as unstable, a financial liability, and someone who had always been a burden on the family. There was a photograph of me from years ago, looking haggard and exhausted at my father's funeral, paired with a recent shot of Lindsay looking powerful and pristine at a campaign rally. The contrast was clearly intentional. Look at what this man has shackled himself to. The third article named its source, the office of Vice President Zhao Hengrui. By noon, it was trending. By evening, it was everywhere. I sat on the floor of the library, my back against the shelf of books I hadn't read, and watched my phone fill with notifications I couldn't bring myself to open. The comments were a swarm of cruelty. She's obviously a gold digger, married him for the money.
Lin Ji's judgment is clearly compromised. How can we trust him to lead the country? Her family are criminals. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I turned off the phone. Then I sat there in the silence and thought about what it would feel like to disappear entirely, not metaphorically, but literally, to simply cease to exist, to stop being a problem for everyone around me. I'd had this thought before, many times, in the years after my father's death, when my relatives were carving up his legacy and I was standing in the corner, watching, unclaimed. But it had never felt as urgent as it did now. The door opened. Lin Ji stood in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the hall light. He took in the scene, me on the floor, my phone face down beside me, my arms wrapped around my knees like a child. And something in his expression shifted. The mask of the politician, the chief strategist, the iron-blooded king of hell, cracked just slightly, revealing something raw underneath. "You've seen the articles," he said. "Yes." He crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt in front of me. This close, I could see the tension in his jaw, the faint dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands, large, capable hands, were clenched at his sides. "Listen to me," he said, and his voice was low, controlled, a blade wrapped in silk. "This is their opening move. It's clumsy and predictable. They're testing our defenses. They want to see if you'll break, if I'll distance myself from you. We are going to give them nothing." "Maybe you should distance yourself from me," I whispered. "I'm ruining everything. Your campaign, your reputation." "Stop." The word was sharp, almost angry. "You don't get to do that. You don't get to erase yourself for my convenience. I didn't marry you so I could throw you away at the first sign of trouble. You married me because a dead man asked you to, I said. The silence that followed was so absolute, I could hear my own heartbeat. Lin Ji stared at me, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that I couldn't categorize, something fierce and wounded and terribly, terribly controlled. Is that what you think? He asked softly. Isn't it the truth? He stood abruptly. My team is already working on a response. Legal is preparing defamation suits. I need you to stay off social media and away from any journalists. Can you do that? I've spent my entire life avoiding attention, I said bitterly. It's the one thing I'm good at. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I felt something crack open inside my chest, something I'd been keeping sealed shut for years. It wasn't attraction, not exactly. It was recognition. The recognition that this man, for all his power and all his ruthlessness, was fighting for me. Not because I'd asked him to, not because I deserved it, but because he'd decided I was worth fighting for. No one had ever decided that before. The filing system you created, he said from the doorway, for my campaign materials? I blinked. You noticed? I notice everything about you, Su-Wan. He paused. It's exceptional work. My campaign manager wants to know who did it. I told him it was my wife. Then he left, and I sat there in the library, surrounded by books and silence, and felt something dangerous and unwelcome bloom in the hollow space beneath my ribs. Over the next 2 weeks, the attacks escalated. A coordinated cyber attack hit the campaign servers, leaking internal polling data and donor lists. My personal information, my address in the small town, my teaching records, my medical history was published on anonymous forums. Strangers began calling my old school, demanding to know about my character. My former landlord gave an interview describing me as quiet, withdrawn, possibly depressive. Each new assault felt like a layer of skin being removed. But something else was happening too, something I hadn't anticipated. In the process of organizing Lin Ji's campaign materials, I'd begun to understand his platform, really understand it. His policies on education reform, healthcare access, anti-corruption legislation, they weren't just political positions, they were convictions. He believed in what he was doing with a ferocity that reminded me of my brother-in-law, the same intellectual passion, the same unwillingness to compromise on principle. And I'd begun, quietly and without anyone's permission, to help. It started with small things. Proofreading his speeches, flagging inconsistencies in his policy documents, reorganizing his debate preparation materials. Then, one evening, I found a gap in his opposition research, a discrepancy in Vice President Zhao's financial disclosures that his team had overlooked and left a note about it on his desk. The next morning, I found a note on mine. 2 words, in that precise, elegant handwriting. Thank you. I kept that note. I folded it carefully and placed it in the pocket of my robe, and I carried it with me like a talisman, a tiny proof that I existed, that I mattered, that someone had seen my work and acknowledged it. I am falling, I thought one night, watching Lin Ji through the library's glass door as he paced during a phone call, his voice rising and falling with controlled fury. I am falling, and I don't know how to stop. The crisis meeting happened on a Thursday. I wasn't supposed to be there. I was supposed to be upstairs, safely tucked away from the political machinery. But Mrs. Chen had accidentally, or perhaps not accidentally, left the study door open, and I'd heard Lin Ji's campaign manager say my name in a tone that made my blood run cold. The Zhao family is going to leak the tax documents next week. We need to get ahead of it. And frankly, Lin Ji, we need to consider whether Su-Wan's continued visibility is... Finish that sentence, Lin Ji said quietly, and you're fired. I pushed open the door. 6 faces turned toward me. The campaign manager, the communications director, the legal counsel, 2 senior strategists, and Lin Ji. The room went silent with the particular quality of silence that follows an explosion. I have a suggestion, I said, and my voice was steadier than I expected. Lin Ji's expression was unreadable. Go on.
I moved to the whiteboard, the one covered in polling data and media strategy diagrams, and picked up a marker. My hand was trembling, but I ignored it. "You're playing defense," I said. "Every time the Zhao family attacks, you respond. You file lawsuits, you issue statements, you try to control the narrative, but you're always one step behind. They're setting the tempo, and you're dancing to it." The campaign manager opened his mouth. Lin Ji raised a hand, and the man went silent. "What if you stopped defending?" I continued. "What if you went on the offensive, not against the accusations about me, but against the accusers? Vice President Zhao's son-in-law has been routing campaign funds through a network of shell companies in the Southern Islands. I found the discrepancy 3 days ago in the public financial disclosures. It's subtle. They've layered it through 4 intermediaries, but if you pull the thread, the entire structure unravels." I drew the diagram on the whiteboard, the money trail, the shell companies, the connections to the vice president's family trust. By the time I finished, my hand had stopped trembling. The room was silent. I turned around. Lin Ji was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not surprise, exactly, but something deeper, something that made the air between us feel charged and electric. His eyes were dark, and his lips were slightly parted, and for one terrifying moment, I felt as though he was seeing me, truly seeing me for the first time. "How did you find this?" the legal counsel asked, his voice hushed. "I'm a teacher," I said. "I know how to do research." Lin Ji stood. The movement was slow, deliberate, the kind of controlled motion that suggested enormous restraint. He walked toward me, and each step seemed to close not just the physical distance between us, but some other distance, some invisible barrier that had existed since the night he'd appeared at my door. He stopped close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Everyone out," he said. They left. The door closed behind them with a soft click. We were alone. "Say that again," he murmured. "Say what?" "That you found a way to destroy Vice President Zhao's entire financial network in 3 days using publicly available documents." Yes, it wasn't difficult. The pattern was there. Someone just needed to look. He made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a groan, and raised his hand. His fingers touched my chin, tilting my face up toward his. The contact was light, barely there, but it sent a current through me that made my knees weak. "You," he said, "are extraordinary." I couldn't breathe. My heart was hammering so hard I was certain he could hear it. His thumb traced the line of my jaw, and I felt every nerve in my body ignite, a cascade of sensation that I had no experience handling. I was 33 years old, and I had been touched so rarely in my adult life that this simple contact, a hand on my chin, felt as intimate as being undressed. "Don't," I whispered. "Don't what?" "Don't look at me like that, like I matter." His eyes went dark. "You matter," he said, and the words were low and rough and absolutely certain. "You have always mattered." Then he kissed me. It was not a gentle kiss. It was not the kind of careful, tentative first kiss that belongs in romance novels. It was fierce and consuming, a kiss that tasted of coffee and determination, a kiss that pressed me back against the whiteboard until my careful diagram smeared against my shoulders. His hand moved from my chin to the back of my neck, pulling me closer, and his other hand found my waist, and I was drowning in the heat of him, the taste of him, the overwhelming reality that this man, this terrifyingly powerful man, wanted me. Me, the invisible woman, the spinster sister, the burden, the nobody. I kissed him back. I didn't decide to. My body decided for me, my hands fisting in the fabric of his shirt, my mouth opening under his, and the sound I made, a small, desperate sound, seemed to undo something in him. He pressed closer, his body hard against mine, and for one perfect, terrifying moment, the world narrowed to the two of us in that room, and nothing else existed. Then I pulled away. "We can't," I said, and my voice was wrecked. "This isn't, we agreed, in name only." He stepped back. His breathing was ragged, and his eyes were still dark, and his self-control, the legendary iron discipline that had earned him the nickname King of Hell, was visibly fractured. "You're right," he said. "I apologize." "Don't apologize." I pressed my hands against the whiteboard behind me, steadying myself. "Just don't do it again." "I can't promise that," he said. And then he left the room, and I stood there with his campaign strategy smeared across my back, and his taste on my lips, and the absolute, devastating certainty that I was in love with a man who had married me out of obligation, and that this love was going to destroy me. The final strike came 5 days before the presidential debate. I was in the library, my sanctuary, my hiding place, when Lindsay's phone began to ring. Then mine. Then every phone in the penthouse, a chorus of digital panic. The broadcast was slick, professional, devastating. Someone had created an entire dossier of fabricated evidence, bank statements, wire transfers, correspondence showing that I had systematically embezzled funds from my brother-in-law's estate before his death. The documents were forgeries, but they were masterful ones, and they painted a picture of a woman who had betrayed her own family's trust, a parasitic figure who had wormed her way into a powerful man's life for financial gain. The timing was surgical, 5 days before the debate. Too late for a thorough investigation to clear my name, too early to ignore. The story detonated across every news network, every social media platform, every corner of the digital landscape. Within hours, the hashtag #DropTheDeadWeight was trending nationwide. I watched it unfold on the television in the living room, my face on the screen, my name in the chyrons, my entire identity reduced to a scandal I hadn't committed. The analysts debated whether Lindsay should divorce me. The pundits speculated about whether our marriage had been legitimate in the first place. A panel of political commentators discussed my face, my clothes, my age, my worth, as though I were a piece of livestock at auction. Something inside me broke. Not cracked, not fractured, broke. Completely, irreparably, like a bone that would never set right again. I sat on the floor. I always seem to end up on the floor during moments of crisis, as though I was trying to get as close to the ground as possible, to make myself as small as I could, and I pressed my face against my knees and I cried. Not the dignified, photogenic tears of a political wife, the ugly, heaving sobs of a woman who had spent 33 years being erased and had finally, conclusively been destroyed. I cried for my father, who had died too young and left me unprotected. For my brother-in-law, who had loved me but hadn't been able to save me. For the life I'd built in that small town, the modest, invisible life that had been the only safety I'd ever known, which was now rubble. And I cried for Lindsay, who had taken a chance on a nobody and was now paying for it with his entire career. I had to leave. That was the only clear thought that emerged from the wreckage. I had to leave before I destroyed him completely, before my presence cost him everything he'd worked for. I could disappear. I was good at disappearing, and maybe, without me dragging him down, he could still win this election. I was packing my suitcase when the bedroom door opened. Lindsay stood in the doorway. He looked, I don't know how to describe it. He looked like a man who had been pushed to the edge of something vast and had decided, calmly and deliberately, to jump. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Leaving," I said, without looking at him. "Before I ruin you completely. Before..." "Put down the suitcase." "Lindsay, put down the suitcase." The command in his voice stopped me cold. I set down the suitcase. My hands were shaking. He crossed the room. He took my face in both his hands, and his fingers were trembling. Lindsay, the man who never trembled, whose hands were steady as stone, and he looked at me with an intensity that felt like being held over a flame. "You are not leaving," he said. "Not now. Not ever. Not because of them." "I'm destroying your campaign." "They are destroying my campaign, not you. You are the only thing in this campaign that I care about keeping." "That's not true. You've worked for this your entire life."
I have worked for this because I believed in something. And then I met you, and I believed in something more. Soo-won, I need you to hear me. I am not going to let them take you away from me. I am going to burn their entire world to the ground before I let that happen." I stared at him. His eyes were ablaze, and his jaw was set. And in that moment, I understood why they called him the King of Hell. Not because he was cruel, because he was relentless. Because when he decided something was his, he defended it with a ferocity that left nothing standing. "What are you going to do?" I whispered. He released my face. He stepped back. And the man who stood before me was no longer my husband. No longer the reserved strategist who ate breakfast in silence and kissed me once against a whiteboard. This was something else entirely, something ancient and ruthless and magnificent. "I'm going to show them," he said quietly, "what happens when you touch what's mine." The press conference was called for 9 o'clock the following morning. Every major network carried it live. I watched from the wings of the stage, hidden behind the curtain, my heart in my throat. Lin Ji stood at the podium in a black suit that made him look like a general about to lead a charge. Behind him, a wall of screens displayed data, financial records, communications transcripts, surveillance footage. He had not told me the details. He had only said, "Watch." The room was packed. Reporters, camera crews, political operatives from every faction. Vice President Zhao's people were in the front row, their faces arranged in expressions of carefully calibrated concern. Lin Ji began to speak. 24 hours ago, he said, his voice carrying through the room with the clarity of a cathedral bell. Fabricated evidence was distributed to every media outlet in this country, accusing my wife, Su Wan, of financial crimes she did not commit. This was a coordinated attack designed to sabotage my candidacy by destroying an innocent woman. I am here to tell you who is responsible, and I am here to ensure they face the consequences. The first screen lit up. Financial records, real ones, not fabrications, showing a network of shell companies routed through the southern islands exactly as I had mapped on the whiteboard. Lin Ji traced the money trail with surgical precision, from Vice President Zhao's family trust through 4 intermediary companies into the accounts of the media operatives who had produced the fake dossier against me. The room went silent. The second screen showed communications, encrypted messages between the vice president's chief of staff and my cousin, laying out the plan in explicit detail. Payment schedules, timelines, instructions on how to forge the bank statements. My cousin's voice in a recorded phone call, laughing about how easy it was to frame me. My hands were over my mouth. I couldn't breathe. The third screen showed the vice president's son-in-law meeting with a known financial criminal in a hotel lobby, exchanging documents. Then came the tax records, the real ones, revealing a decade of unreported income, tax evasion on a monumental scale, and illegal campaign contributions that violated every election law on the books. Lin Ji looked directly at the front row, where the vice president's people were sitting in various stages of visible collapse. "Every piece of evidence I've presented has been submitted to the federal prosecutor's office," he said. "Indictments are pending. The individuals responsible for this attack, including several members of Vice President Zhao's immediate staff and family, will face criminal charges." Then he paused. The room held its breath. "One more thing," he said, and his voice dropped to a register so low it was almost intimate, almost tender, almost dangerous.
I have heard the commentators and the pundits and the anonymous critics suggest that I should distance myself from my wife, that I should divorce her to save my campaign, that she is, he paused, and I saw the muscle in his jaw clench, dead weight. He looked directly into the camera. Su Wan is my wife. She is the most intelligent, most courageous, most extraordinary person I have ever known. And I want to be perfectly clear about something. Anyone who touches her touches my entire campaign team. Anyone who threatens her threatens me.
And anyone who believes they can use her to destroy me should understand that I will use every resource at my disposal, every legal, political, and personal resource to ensure their complete and total ruin. That is not a threat. That is a promise. The room erupted. I stood behind the curtain, tears streaming down my face, my hands shaking, my entire body trembling with an emotion I couldn't name. It was too big for any word I knew. It was gratitude and disbelief and something luminous and overwhelming. The feeling of being seen, truly seen, by someone who had decided that I was worth everything. He had burned their world down for me. The invisible woman, the spinster, the nobody, for me. Lindsay left the podium and walked toward the wings of the stage. When he reached me, he didn't say anything. He just pulled me into his arms and held me against his chest, and I could feel his heart beating fast, faster than I'd expected, and I realized that he'd been afraid. Not of the press, not of the political fallout, but afraid that I would still try to leave. "You didn't have to do that," I said into his chest. "Yes," he said, "I did." I pulled back and looked at his face. His eyes were bright, almost feverish, and his hands on my waist were firm, possessive, as though he was physically preventing the world from pulling me away. "I love you," I said. The words came out before I could stop them, and I didn't want to stop them, and I didn't care that we were standing behind a curtain at a press conference while the political landscape of our country shifted beneath our feet. His expression. God, his expression. The iron-blooded king of hell looked at me with the open, unguarded tenderness of a man who had been waiting 7 years to hear those words. "I know," he whispered. "I've been waiting for you to figure it out." He told me that night, in the quiet of the penthouse after the world had finished exploding. We were in the kitchen, our kitchen, the place where we'd had our first real conversation. And he was making me tea with the methodical precision of a man who was about to say something that cost him dearly. "7 years ago," he said, "your brother-in-law invited me to his home for dinner. I was nobody then, a junior strategist, hungry and ambitious, and convinced that politics was everything. He was my mentor, the man who taught me that power without principle was just tyranny in a nice suit." He set the cup in front of me. His hands were steady now. There was a photograph on his desk, a woman in a garden reading a book. She was wearing a yellow dress, and the sunlight was in her hair, and she was completely absorbed in whatever she was reading. She had no idea the photograph was being taken. She wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to be beautiful. She just was. He sat down across from me. "I asked your brother-in-law who she was. He said, 'My younger sister, the smartest person in my family and the most undervalued.' I asked if I could meet her. He laughed and said you lived in a small town and had no interest in politics or politicians." "He wasn't wrong," I murmured. "No," Lindsay agreed, "he wasn't. But I kept that photograph, not physically, in my mind. Every time I achieved something, a campaign victory, a policy breakthrough, a moment of recognition, I thought of the woman in the yellow dress, reading her book in the sunlight, completely unaware of the world watching her, and I thought, that is who I'm doing this for. Someone who doesn't need power, who doesn't want it, who exists outside of it entirely. Someone who is genuinely, authentically good." My throat was tight. My eyes were burning. "When your brother-in-law died," he continued, "and left me that message, yes, it was about protection. Yes, it was about duty. But Soo-won, you need to understand. I had been looking for a reason to find you for 7 years. His death gave me one. I am ashamed of that. I am ashamed that it took his death to bring me to your door. But I am not ashamed of what I found there." "A woman in a cardigan with pen on her hands," I said, trying to smile. "A woman who was exactly who I thought she'd be," he said, "brilliant, proud, stubborn, wounded, and completely, heartbreakingly invisible to everyone who should have been paying attention."
He reached across the table and took my hand. "I didn't marry you to fulfill a dying wish," he said. "I married you because I've been in love with you for 7 years, and his dying wish was the only excuse I had to make it happen. In this election, I only want to win for you, so you'll never have to be invisible again." I couldn't speak. I was crying again, but these were different tears, not the ugly, desperate sobs of a woman breaking apart, but the quiet, cleansing tears of a woman being put back together. "I don't know how to do this," I said finally. "I don't know how to be visible. I don't know how to be a wife or a political figure or any of the things this life requires. I've spent 33 years learning how to disappear, and I don't know how to unlearn it." "Then learn something new," he said simply. "You're a teacher. You know how to learn." I laughed, a real laugh, not the hysterical sound I'd made the night he proposed, but a genuine, surprised burst of joy. "I'm a very good teacher," I said. "I know," he replied. "You've been teaching my entire campaign team how to do their jobs properly for the past month." The election was held on a Tuesday. I stood beside Lin Ji at his campaign headquarters as the results came in, wearing a dress I'd chosen myself, not something the stylist had selected, not something designed to make me look like someone I wasn't, but a simple, elegant thing in deep blue that made me feel like me. My hair was down, my hands were steady. The numbers climbed all evening. The vice president's party collapsed, undone by the scandals Lin Ji had exposed, their voter base hemorrhaging to our side in a flood of public outrage. My cousin had been arrested, the vice president's son-in-law was under federal investigation, the shell companies had been dismantled, their assets frozen, their operators facing decades in prison. When the final count was announced, Lin Ji had won by the largest margin in the country's history. The room erupted. Staff, volunteers, supporters, everyone was screaming, embracing, weeping with joy. Confetti fell from the ceiling, music blared from speakers. The air itself seemed to vibrate with triumph. Lin Ji turned to me. The noise faded. The confetti slowed. The world contracted to the space between his body and mine. "Come with me," he said, and took my hand. He led me to the stage. The stage. The one with the cameras and the spotlights and the microphones. The one where the president-elect was supposed to stand and address the nation. And he brought me to the center of it, into the blinding light, and the crowd fell silent. And I stood there. Me, Soo-won, the invisible woman, the spinster sister, the burden, the nobody. And I let the world see me. I was not beautiful in the conventional sense. I was not young, not glamorous, not the kind of woman who belonged on a stage. But I was there. I was real. I was standing next to the man I loved, and he was holding my hand, and the country was looking at me. And for the first time in my life, I did not want to disappear. Lin Ji leaned into the microphone. "I want to thank my wife," he said, "who taught me that the most important thing about power is not having it, it's using it to protect the people who matter." The crowd roared. I squeezed his hand. That night, after the celebrations, after the speeches and the handshakes and the flashbulbs, we went home. Not to the penthouse, which had always felt more like a command center than a home. To a new place, an apartment Lin Ji had quietly been preparing for weeks, a space that was warm and filled with books and had a kitchen where we could stand at the counter at 2 a.m. and drink tea and talk about nothing. He kissed me in the doorway, not the fierce, consuming kiss from the strategy room, a slower kiss, tender, the kind of kiss that says, "We have time now. We have all the time in the world." "What happens next?" I asked when we finally broke apart. "Everything," he said. "Everything happens next." I smiled. For the first time in 33 years, I believed it. My name is Soo-won. I am the wife of the president-elect. I am a teacher, a strategist, and, as of very recently, a woman who knows what it feels like to be loved without reservation or condition. I used to be invisible. I used to believe that invisibility was safety, that the smaller I made myself, the less the world could hurt me. I was wrong. The world hurts you regardless. The only question is whether you face it alone or with someone beside you, someone who sees you, truly sees you, and decides that what he sees is worth fighting for. Lindsay fought for me. He burned down empires for me. He stood on a stage in front of the entire nation and said my name like it was something precious. And I, the woman in the yellow dress, reading her book in the sunlight, completely unaware that anyone was watching. I finally looked up.
The end.